Fishing vessel destination, fishing vessel destination. This is Coast Guard aircraft, channel 16. Fishing vessel destination, fishing vessel destination. This is Coast Guard aircraft calling fishing vessel destination, channel 16.
The primary source for this video is the U.S. Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation report into the commercial fishing vessel destination sinking, and its supporting materials published February of 2019, 2 years after the incident. And a strong secondary source is the NTSB's Marine Accident Brief titled Capsizing and Sinking of Fishing Vessel Destination, published June of 2018. From the U.S. Coast Guard, quote, "The Coast Guard was the lead federal agency for initial evidence collection activities and led all efforts to recover additional evidence at the casualty site. The NTSB participated in all hearing sessions, and the Marine Board and NTSB shared all evidence and factual material gathered throughout the course of their investigations. However, the Marine Board and NTSB worked separately during the analysis phase of their respective investigations in order to prepare independent conclusions and recommendations." And I'd like to point out, all this is to say, the findings presented in this video, just like many of our previous videos, are from the investigative groups who produced these reports, the agencies, witnesses, and parties involved who participated directly or provided testimony in the aftermath of the sinking. As always, the link to all of our research, like primary and secondary sources, cross-references, and featured media, will be in the description. The Compass Rose. Built in 1981 by J&S Marine Services in Brazoria, Texas, the fishing vessel, or FV Destination, started its life as the Compass Rose, an 82-foot long, 26-foot wide house-forward fishing vessel with a draft of about 12.5 feet. The Compass Rose was built originally with the intention to carry stacks of pots for crab fishing, along with the necessary crab pot loading table. The loading table is what allows those larger crab pots to be hauled aboard, placed against the gunwale, and handled in a way that would be near impossible without it. However, despite its already built-in pot fishing design, when the vessel changed hands in '92, the new owner sought to lengthen and widen the hull and renew the house deck, which included raising it by 3 feet along with adding new fish holds. This work would be performed by Tim Alls Shipbuilding of Seattle, Washington. The newly renovated and heavily modified vessel would then receive the name it became known for, Destination. The vessel's length was increased to 98.6 feet, an increase of nearly 17 feet. Its width increased from 26 to just over 32 feet, with the reported draft depth increasing by only about 7 inches. The Compass Rose was essentially cut in half with a, quote, "new prefabricated section including new holds and piping, replacing the entire hull section aft of the engine room bulkhead." Despite all these significant modifications to create the newly renovated FV Destination, incredibly, it's reported by both investigative agencies that the Seattle shipyard performing the work, quote, "did not produce or maintain formalized construction or arrangement plans reflecting these modifications." And from the NTSB, investigators gathered evidence from witnesses, shipyard billing records, and other documents that chronicled the history of construction and repairs completed on the Destination to determine if there were any modifications that would have added weight and thereby affected its stability. However, few plans or drawings were found describing changes to the vessel over the years. While the vessel maintained a relatively similar shape and layout in general, many of these modifications were more substantial than their appearance would suggest, especially their potential to affect vessel stability. Like we mentioned, it was lengthened, widened, and the wheelhouse was raised by 3 feet, but the owner, FV Destination Incorporated of Seattle, Washington, would perform even more modifications later in the boat's life, which we will cover in a bit. It should be noted, though, despite the reported lack of paperwork which, according to investigators, should have accompanied those major modifications of 92. It's reported that the owner did hire a naval architect for the purposes of calculating stability of the newly renovated destination. The NTSB continues. A naval architect was hired to evaluate the effect of the new modifications on the vessel's stability. He developed vessel drawings reflecting the modifications, conducted an inclining test, and generated both a letter documenting his stability assessment and a trim and stability booklet, dated October 27, 1993. This assessment confirmed that the vessel met the fishing vessel criteria for stability found in Title 46 Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Part 28, and could carry up to 249 pots. The pots referred to in this trim and stability booklet, along with those used for the previously named compass rose, measured in at 6.5 by 6.5 feet and 34 inches deep. Their weight, including their lines and buoys, put them right at 700 pounds each. Brick Immortar takes no sponsorships. We don't do affiliate links, and I refuse all offers from any type of brand deals, investors, or private equity. The channel is 100% owned by me, Sam. Brick Immortar has strict policies against utilizing AI for research, script writing, explainer drawings, voiceovers, 3D models, 3D environments, thumbnails, descriptions, audio effects, subtitles, captions, and any marketing graphic design generation. My voiceover is and always has been 100% performed by me personally. I've taken courses, practiced, and trained over the years for a classic narration or audiobook-like sound and cadence, and am always working to improve it. With that said, this channel wouldn't be able to continue if it weren't for the financial support from our patrons, channel members, and those who support via brickimmortar.com. Even liking, subscribing, and sharing is a huge help as well. Because we are not beholden to any sort of studios, sponsors, corporate interests, private equities, and because YouTube's ad revenue is nowhere near predictable. The dedicated supporters who believe in our mission and support the work we do, from our meticulously human researched scripts to our human drawn explainers, from the work I do personally in rehearsing, recording, and cleaning up my voiceovers, to the carefully researched human crafted 3D models used in our human crafted 3D environments. Our supporters understand these efforts take time. They trust us to strive toward ever-improving research, reporting, and presentation, and they know that we take our work seriously behind the scenes, between each upload. You know who you are. Thanks for supporting Brick Immortar. And don't forget, your safety matters. From the U.S. Coast Guard. When developing the destination stability instructions in '93, the qualified individual used 700 pounds as the weight of each crab pot, including gear, within his calculations. The captain of the vessel at the time informed him of the crab pot's weight, but the qualified individual did not verify the actual weight of each pot through direct observation. Further, the qualified individual did not specifically indicate the weight of each crab pot within the stability instructions, which does appear to be the case, as neither the weight nor the dimensions of the pots appear to be listed in that 1993 booklet. Only the amount total and their amount per tier or stacked layer, according to condition number. Now, condition number in this instance is used as a quick reference within the trim and stability booklet for various configurations of the amount of fuel oil levels, crab pots, tonnage stored on deck, hold levels, stores, and so on. For example, in the 93 booklet, condition number 2 appears to provide the stability needed to haul that maximum number of 249 pots stacked on deck and a total weight of 496 long tons. This condition provides the brief description: full consumables, referring to fuel oil and freshwater tanks, full pot load, those 249 crab pots, and one hold tanked. This refers to the fish holds directly below deck on vessel centerline. A tanked hold means they leave port with a hold full of seawater, sometimes in preparation to keep live catch. However, if we refer to condition number 6, a somewhat lighter condition at 329 long tons, we can see that with fuel oil and freshwater levels low, and some tanks empty, total crab pots allowable is at only 200, and quote, vessel has a high center of gravity in this condition, but there is also adequate freeboard, so vessel passes the criteria under all conditions. However, good practice would be to keep at least one hold tanked while pots are on deck. the fish hold being tanked or full of water, acting as ballast once underway, like any other tanks or holds below decks. This is a prime example of the careful consideration required for trim and stability, and why a booklet like this exists in the first place. These combinations, or conditions, require a thorough and detailed understanding of all items involved, their exact weights, dimensions, amounts, position on or in the vessel. This applies just as much to the weight of each crab pot, for instance, as it does to the ballast below the waterline. The destination would go on to be an active fishing vessel, seemingly without any major incidents aside from a couple oil discharges, one in 98 and another in 05, appearing to keep their fishing certifications current for most of the 2000s and into the teens. And just to note, prior dates not appearing in these records don't necessarily indicate their certifications weren't active. It's more likely the records just weren't as readily available in online databases for those prior to 03, for any number of reasons. According to both the NTSB and Coast Guard, in 2011 the destination received another modification worth noting due to its added weight relatively high up on the vessel. The NTSB states, quote, "During a May 2011 shipyard period in Seattle, the bulwark was raised with the installation of 3,366 pounds of steel plate. Investigators, however, found no evidence confirming an assessment of the vessel's stability following this modification, which would have affected the destination's lightweight characteristics and therefore its stability." And from the Coast Guard, a Marine Fluid Systems Incorporated invoice dated May 9, 2011, described the installation as bow addition/cap rail, consisting of 264 square feet of 5/16-inch plate. The Marine Board was not provided documentation indicating that a qualified individual conducted a stability assessment of this new bulwark installation. This was despite the specific regulation, quote, "requiring a qualified individual to determine if modifications to a vessel constitute a substantial alteration that would adversely affect a vessel's stability." And from that same section, 28.501, specifically paragraph D, item 4, quote, "In determining whether or not a vessel's stability has been adversely affected, a qualified individual must, at a minimum, consider the net effects on stability of increase in free surface effects due to water on deck associated with any increase in length or height of bulwarks." And from Brick Immortar's own consulting AB, Michael, aboard freighters regularly, regarding that raised bow bulwark, Michael states, quote, "They definitely have their benefits for deflecting spray and eliminating the hazards associated with low railings. But on the freezing spray note, it collects on them and you end up with a beard of ice." We also noticed, when analyzing the history of this vessel for our 3D model, that this port side gunwale amidships was raised considerably at some point early on, well prior to the bow gunwale being raised. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the port side of the destination had a raised shelter bulwark from the deckhouse to the midship crane. This would increase the required frame port area on the port side by an additional 550 inches squared. A vessel with insufficient frame port area would likely result in more seawater becoming trapped on the main deck in foul weather. This water would add additional weight to the vessel, raise the vessel's overall vertical center of gravity, or VCG, and increase the free surface moment acting on the vessel as the water flows side to side. These factors would negatively impact the vessel's intact stability. And with the gunwale additions to the bow requiring 264 square feet of steel plate, weighing more than 3,300 pounds, it's likely this raised portside gunwale amidships added significant weight as well. Keep in mind, the trim and stability booklet investigators refer to as having potentially been used aboard the destination does not factor in this bow bulwark addition. It can be seen somewhat clearly in these images that the calculations are factoring in the previous raised portside gunwale amidships, but you can see here the bow gunwale is still just capped with a railing on top in this drawing by the, quote, qualified individual, meaning these trim and stability instructions would predate those May 2011 modifications. The vessel's next occurrence of note took place in 2012 from the U.S. Coast Guard. During the fall of 2012 crabbing season, the destination sustained hull damage while operating in sea ice conditions. In November 2012, the vessel entered the dry dock at Pacific Fishermen Incorporated, Seattle, Washington. A surveyor from Waypoint Marine Surveyors evaluated the damage and completed a report. The report stated there was moderate to heavy indents to the port and starboard side shear strake from the bow stem to approximately number 6 frame aft, main deck edge down to below the waterline, transom stern plating from deck edge to chine, and indents to the bow wrapper plate. And the NTSB backs this finding, quote, "In November 2012, the Destination entered dry dock for repairs after it sustained hull damage while operating in sea ice earlier in the fall season. At that time, the shipyard also installed a bulbous bow, for which a naval architect was again hired to design and conduct a vessel stability assessment." The U.S. Coast Guard states, the stability assessment for the bulbous bow was limited to the bulbous bow installation and hull steel repairs, and did not include any other weight changes to the vessel. The owner did not hold discussions with the naval architect regarding changes in sizes and weights of the crab pots used on the Destination. The owner assumed nothing changed on the stability report. And from the NTSB, in a January 28, 2013 letter to the owner reporting his stability assessment, the naval architect referenced the stability information provided in the 1993 Trim and Stability booklet, rather than update the booklet with the latest and past modifications. Based on his calculations, he determined that the installation of the bulbous bow had a negligible reduction to the vessel's stability. Prior to this, the Destination had the conventional or smooth bow with no protrusion it was originally built with. The bulbous bow is said to potentially reduce drag, increase efficiency, then increasing the vessel's range in turn. With the owner stating, via the Coast Guard's report, quote, "He installed the bulbous bow after learning they reduced and slowed vessel pitching and increased fuel economy. Because piping connects the bulbous bow into the forward freshwater tanks, it enabled the crew to flood the bulbous bow for trim and ship handling adjustments." Again, without a conclusive study or inclining by professionals into how all these new additions to the vessel interact with each other, regarding stability, center of mass, reserve buoyancy, etc., it's impossible to know definitively exactly what the updated trim and stability conditions would look like. And another factor pointed out by our crew member Michael is the potential combination of the additional, now further forward source of sea spray caused by the new bulbous bow, and the raised bow gunnels being there to catch that extra spray whenever ice accumulation is possible. Investigators also point out, as background on the vessel, steering system issues that came up multiple times throughout the 2010s. From the U.S. Coast Guard, May 2011, a steering system overhaul in Dutch Harbor. January 2013, while in dry dock at Coastal Fluid Power in Seattle, steering hydro line replacement, materials and repair to reinstall mechanical systems in engine room to fit around new steelwork. June 2015, a crack was welded on the steering system's hydraulic holding tank to correct a leak. The steering system was refilled with hydraulic fluid, then purged and tested to ensure it was back in working order. October 16, 2015, the captain sent a text message to the owner via satellite regarding a steering failure incident. He sent the following, quote, "Both steering pumps are sticking again randomly. I can unstick them with the jog stick by switching pumps back and forth and hitting the jog stick." April through July 2016, in dry dock again at Coastal Fluid Power, Seattle, another steering system overhaul. The president and owner of the repair yard stated that this repair was, quote, "a complete teardown and rebuild of the steering system. Fabricated a new hydraulic tank and went through all the components. The crew of the Destination had explained to him there was a case where the steering had got stuck hard over for some reason, and the crew was able to turn on the auxiliary system and continue to steer the boat. The mechanics found contamination particulates, very small solid particulates such as old sandblasting media, in the hydraulic spool valve that would have caused that valve to stick. After much troubleshooting, they believed the system required a high-velocity flush to clean it. They retested the system during sea trials with the electronics technician to make sure the autopilot was interfacing properly with the actual mechanical steering system in the engine room. Results of the sea trials proved positive that the steering system was operational." Unquote. An ongoing potential factor we've touched on in so many other related videos, like the Northern Belle and Alaska Ranger, is the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, exception provided to vessels like these, and how this carve-out's nuance potentially allows vessels with lacking stability evaluations to operate regularly in U.S. waters. From the NTSB, as a vessel that harvested crab, fished for cod, and operated part-time in the summer months as a fish tender vessel, the destination was subject to the requirements for uninspected vessels in the commercial fishing industry found in Title 46 CFR Part 28, and from the U.S. Coast Guard more specifically, quote, Title 46 CFR 28.530 requires owners of certain commercial fishing vessels to provide to the captain stability instructions. The regulations do not require a regulatory agency or third-party review or approval of the stability instructions at any specified time interval. The preamble to the final rule explained, for inspected vessels, such as passenger vessels and freight ships, the Coast Guard reviews stability instructions to ensure that the information provided to operating personnel is suitable and accurate. For uninspected vessels, such as commercial fishing vessels, with no regulatory body or other third-party examination of stability evaluations or instructions, the responsibility for determining the accuracy and detail of stability instructions rests with the vessel owner. However, at the same time, from the NTSB, the destination's owner voluntarily participated in the Coast Guard's Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Examination Program, which primarily focuses on life-saving equipment on board the vessel, not the hull or machinery, or stability. These exams are valid for 2 years. During the last safety exam that was conducted on the destination in June of 2016, the vessel was found to be in compliance and carrying the required life-saving equipment, an A406 EPIRB, an 8-person life raft, 6 immersion suits, 6 personal flotation devices, and 2 life rings. And for what it's worth, I'd also like to add the Coast Guard points out, Coast Guard dockside safety examinations are voluntary, no-fault, and non-adversarial in nature. They serve as an information resource, encourage compliance with the commercial fishing vessel regulations of 46 CFR Subchapter C, and discourage unsafe operations. Upon successful completion of a dockside exam, the examiner issues an examination decal valid for 2 years. Sand Point, Alaska, Saturday, February 4th, 2017. The destination had returned to their hailing port of Sand Point from a 27-day cod fishing expedition in the Aleutians, specifically near False Pass and Sanak Island, from the U.S. Coast Guard. According to text and email messages to family, the crew members mentioned they were tired, bruised, and sore after working grueling hours while fishing for cod. While docked at Sand Point, they would begin preparations for the switch from cod fishing gear to opilio, or snow crab fishing gear. This meant switching out each fishing pot's configuration one by one. Sand Point was just their hailing port though, a place they could store and swap gear and take on oil and diesel fuel. The bait needed for crab fishing would be picked up during upcoming stops in King Cove and Dutch Harbor. The captain planned bait pickups for both locations, and then counted on addressing a main engine exhaust leak repair once in Dutch Harbor. The fatigued crew wouldn't be getting much time away from the vessel, however. If there was any shore leave at this point, it would have taken place between February 5th and 7th, as their preparations had them scheduled to leave out Wednesday morning, February 8th, bound directly for their next port of call, Peter Pan Seafoods in King Cove, Alaska. As a side note, whenever they were actively fishing, the U.S. Coast Guard, quote, a former crew member stated that the crew working for 24 hours wasn't uncommon. 36, 48 hours straight wasn't uncommon, especially if there were delivery dates that had to be met depending on the scenarios. It just really all depended on how the season got off to a start. If we were running behind schedule, usually that first trip was hell. Another former crew member stated that a normal schedule would include 20 hours on with 4 hours off. He added they never were able to get 8 hours of sleep at night while fishing. Also of note was that, according to the Coast Guard, there were no written or verbal policies regarding work or rest hours, and quote, the owner left vessel work rest hours up to the captain and crew. At the time, the current crew aboard the Destination consisted of Captain Hathaway, 60 years old, well-respected, and known as, quote, very capable and knowledgeable. He'd been captain of the Destination for 23 years. From the Coast Guard. In 1993, the Destination's owner stopped operating vessels to take an active role as owner management, including owning and operating the Silent Lady for a short period, and then acquiring the Lady Joanne. In 93, the owner hired Captain Hathaway to operate the Destination, also allowing the captain to hire and decide the vessel's crew. The engineer on board was highly experienced as well, at 55 years of age with 21 years aboard the Destination. And there were 4 deckhands. Deckhand 1 had been aboard for 22 years, deckhands 2 and 3 for 7 years. Deckhand 4 was the least experienced but still quite familiar, having been aboard for 3 years. Reportedly, this was a very competent, tight-knit crew of 6 that knew each other and their vessel well. Departing Sand Point on Wednesday, February 8th, at about 10 a.m., the Destination had taken on just over 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel, 3 drums of 15W40 oil, and 1 drum of hydraulic oil. Their day-long journey to King Cove would be uneventful, mooring at Peter Pan Seafoods by roughly 7 p.m. that night, and from the U.S. Coast Guard. At approximately 1900 hours, or 7 p.m., the Destination arrived into King Cove and moored at Peter Pan Seafoods. The crew loaded 3,080 pounds of sardine bait from Peter Pan and completed an Alaska Department of Fish and Game, or ADF&G, Opelio crab certification inspection. The Fish and Game inspector noted the vessel was loaded with 200 total pots, 10 of which still outfitted for groundfish, or specifically cod in this instance. The Destination wouldn't linger in King Cove, though. They'd leave out by 10 p.m. that same night, bound directly for Dutch Harbor. Now, the crab pots referred to here on board the Destination were roughly 7 by 7 foot by 34 inches. Each of these cages is quite complex and made mostly of steel, which makes them heavy. Adding to the weight per pot is an attached set of buoys and hundreds of feet of thick lines, bringing them to an estimated 700 pounds each. This can add up. Once you're factoring in this weight per unit for a load of hundreds of pots, according to authorities, vessel stability can depend heavily on these numbers being correct, a crucial factor to keep in mind. Dutch Harbor, Thursday, February 9th, 2017. As the Destination approached Dutch Harbor, from the Coast Guard, quote, a Coast Guard petty officer from Marine Safety Detachment, or MSD, Dutch Harbor, received a phone call from the captain of the Destination. The captain informed the petty officer that he was calling with his 24-hour departure notification required by Alaska state regulation. The petty officer asked him if he would like to complete a voluntary Coast Guard Stability and Safety Compliance Check, or SSC. The captain responded that he did not need one. If it wasn't a requirement, then he didn't want one. The petty officer asked if he completed an SSC back in October of 2016, to which the captain replied that he did. The petty officer then asked him if he was carrying more or less pots than he operated with in October of 2016, to which he stated that he was carrying less pots. The petty officer let him know that it was not a requirement to have the Coast Guard conduct an SSC at this time, but if he wanted one while he was in Dutch Harbor, the MSD was more than willing to conduct one. The captain concluded the conversation by stating, "If it is not required, I don't need it." And according to the Coast Guard, it turns out, the Destination actually did not have a stability and safety compliance check performed back in October of 2016 either, instead finding that their most recent check of this type was actually back in 2012, an important factor to keep in mind. However, the NTSB points out that a safety exam, valid for 2 years each time, the type that does not factor in the hull, machinery, or stability, was performed in June of 2016, and quote, the vessel was found to be in compliance and carrying the required life-saving equipment, again, an A406 EPIRB, an 8-person life raft, 6 immersion suits, 6 personal flotation devices, and 2 life rings. That evening, about 6:30 p.m., they'd arrive in Dutch Harbor without incident, mooring at Kloosterboer cold storage facility to take on more bait in the form of squid. However, potentially unbeknownst to the destination's crew, as they navigated the harbor, the crew of another fishing vessel nearby, the April Lane, was, quote, alarmed about the destination's loaded condition, given the NWS, or National Weather Service, forecast of freezing spray warnings. And we will discuss the weather forecast here in a moment. But the April Lane's captain was so alarmed by destination's loaded condition that he actually had his deckhand take a brief video, which shows the fishing vessel's towering tiers of pot stacks. In addition, once the destination was moored at the cold storage facility to take on bait, yet another crew on a vessel docked nearby, aboard the Ocean Rover, was also concerned, and snapped these very clear photos showing the pots and their stacked configuration. The crew member indicated that he took the pictures after he noticed the enormous amount of crab pots loaded on board the destination. And from the U.S. Coast Guard, the destination typically carried 200 pots stacked in 5 tiers and with number 1 and 2 holds flooded or tanked. When transiting from port to port or between fishing grounds with a full pot load, the first tier of pots was stored vertically, standing up on its end, and the upper tiers were stored horizontally on their sides. By leaving a gap down the center line of the deck, the crew created a 7-foot tall by 36-inch wide tunnel. The tunnel allowed the crew to walk along the deck down the center line to reach the stern cleats, as well as to access the hatch covers located center line on the deck, including all hold hatches, steering room, and lazarette. Reportedly, though, it's not like huge pot stacks are a rare sight. The concern expressed by other vessels nearby in this instance was due to that widely known freezing spray forecast. In addition, with their bait stores loaded previously back at King Cove, either much or all of the bait picked up at Dutch Harbor was bound for transit directly to the Pribilof Islands, ferried from Trident Seafood's Dutch Harbor to Trident Seafood's on St. Paul Island, due to the outpost-like facilities' diminishing stock and high demand. And with 10 pots kept in a groundfish configuration, presumably, once their fishing expedition would begin, after their upcoming final port of call, the destination planned to also use their own cod catch as additional crab bait. From the U.S. Coast Guard, quote, the destination's crew loaded 4 pallets of squid, weighing a total of 7,060 pounds on top of the 5th tier of crab pots. With the crew carefully placing and arranging the bait on top of the crab pots, it appears the crew intended to leave the bait in that position for the voyage to St. Paul. On previous occasions, the captain directed the crew to load totes usually containing about 1,000 pounds of bait on top of the crab pots prior to transit. However, the NTSB contradicts the placement of those 4 pallets a bit, stating, quote, between 6:35 and 7 p.m., the crew loaded 4 pallets of bait weighing a total of 7,060 pounds. Former crew members estimated that the freezer for the bait would have been filled to capacity, presumably due to the sardine bait loaded back at King Cove, and that the excess bait was stored either in totes or pallets on both the main deck forward of the pot stack and the O1 deck aft of the wheelhouse. Furthering these conflicting reports, the U.S. Coast Guard states again, quote, the bait was loaded 4 across on top of the crab pots amidships, next to 2 totes and a sorting table. Now, you can also see some various items loaded atop the pot stack in these photos on screen, timestamped at approximately 6:40 p.m. prior to taking on those 4 pallets of squid, like a single pallet, a few totes or boxes, and possibly that sorting table. Keeping in mind, the NTSB states in their report that the 4 heavy squid pallets were placed, quote, forward of the pot stack on deck. Here in these photos, we can see the cold storage facility's fork trucks staging what appears to be those 4 pallets of squid on the pier, which to me look substantial, especially given a total weight of about 7,000 pounds, or approximately 1,750 pounds per pallet, each pallet adding the equivalent of roughly 2.5 crab pots, for reference. If placed this high atop the pot stack versus nestled lower and further forward on deck, this could have also made a significant difference towards stability. Now, we know there was a bait hold in the area of the boat the NTSB is referring to, just forward of the open deck, according to these drawings from the TNS booklet. And we also know the crew had picked up bait prior, back in King Cove, and that it had potentially filled this designated bait hold, possibly leaving it unavailable for several more pallets worth. This clip from approximately 6:30 to 7 p.m., taken by the Kloosterboer Cold Storage Facility's security camera, does appear to show the white pallets of squid being lifted from the staging area by the destination's crane and crew and then resting atop the pot stack. The forklifts now absent, and ship's crane having been in motion, with presumably the ocean rover in view more just aft of destination. It's unclear whether they traveled in this configuration as seen in the video, or maybe moved them later to where the NTSB indicates they were stored. It seems, in my observation, a rather significant factor in the vessel's stability, and, other than off-duty crew statements to the contrary, the NTSB's source of their contradicting info, I just don't see any evidence that points to why the NTSB contradicts what everything else appears to show, that the pallets, indeed, were stacked atop the crab pots. Soon after, at roughly 7 p.m., the Coast Guard states the destination shifted berths to the nearby Trident Seafoods facility. While there, the captain departed the vessel to pick up a gasket to make repairs to the main engine's leaking exhaust. He returned shortly thereafter to start installing the new gasket. Around the same time, quote, 2 former crew members at the destination, currently working on the fishing vessel Carrie Marie, moored in Dutch Harbor at the time, visited the destination. One of the former crew members gave the destination's crew a ride to a nearby bar/restaurant, where the destination's captain purchased dinner for all of them. However, the destination's engineer wouldn't get to partake, being ordered by the captain to return to the vessel and continue to, quote, work on the stuffing box to the propeller shaft. During conversations with the former crew member, the engineer mentioned that he was dealing with the leaking stuffing box during the whole cod season. The engineer explained the stuffing box leak required him to pump the engine room bilge out every couple of hours. In addition to the leaking stuffing box, some of the other destination's crew members complained to the former crew member that during cod season, harvested fish from the holds clogged the seawater pumps in the engine room. This required the crew to work over 40 hours to repair. That former crew member also recounted, referring to their previous fishing season and dinner in Dutch Harbor, quote, the boys were pretty beat down. It was a pretty grueling cod season. They were running 24-hour shifts, with the crew member acting as the relief captain. I believe they were doing 4 or 6-hour rotations, sleep turns. They were pretty haggard. I worked with those guys a long time, and yeah, they were pretty beat down, a table of long faces. Heavy freezing spray. That weather forecast was the primary concern for those fellow fishers in and around the harbor when they snapped photos of the destination that evening. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the National Weather Service, or NWS, issues freezing spray warnings several days in advance, 48 to 72 hours, of predicted conditions. Understanding mariners use this information to make pre-planning voyage decisions. The NWS forecasts 2 ice accumulation categories, freezing or heavy freezing spray. Freezing spray equates to the overland method light condition, and heavy freezing spray includes overland method moderate, heavy, and extreme conditions. The overland method established sea spray ice accumulation graphs for vessels between 20 and 70 meters in length. The destination was about 30 meters long. These charts on screen provide examples of overland method graphs for water temperatures at various air temperatures and wind speeds. An icing predictor algorithm developed at the University of Alaska Fairbanks helps predict sea spray ice accumulation rates for vessels. And from the NTSB, sea spray icing has long been a serious hazard to marine vessels because the ice accumulates over exposed decks and exterior surfaces of a vessel, thereby adding weight that may ultimately capsize a vessel. As defined by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sea spray icing occurs in environmental conditions where cold, wave-generated spray contacts exposed surfaces and air temperatures are below freezing. Factors affecting sea spray icing include wind speed, air temperature, water temperature, freezing temperature of water, relative wind direction, and sea and swell wave characteristics, like height, period, and propagation direction. Contributing factors based on characteristics of the vessel include speed, heading, with respect to wind, waves, and swell, length and amount of freeboard, or the distance between the waterline and uppermost watertight deck. In general, under similar environmental conditions, more sea spray reaches the deck and superstructure when the vessel travels faster into the wind and waves, particularly for smaller vessels and vessels with less freeboard. With this in mind, authorities issued the following relevant marine forecasts for the area. The Coast Guard's report shows NWS freezing spray warnings for the relevant areas issued at 3:15 p.m., Thursday afternoon, February 9th. Cape Sarachev to Nikolsky, Bering Side, which is a warning area that encompasses Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. Gale warning Friday and Friday night, heavy freezing spray warning Friday night. The area of Bering offshore east of longitude 171 west, encompassing the waters between Dutch Harbor and St. Paul Island. Heavy freezing spray warning through Friday night. And the Pribilof Islands near shore waters, which includes St. Paul Island, the destination's next port of call, and St. George Island, which lies between Dutch Harbor and St. Paul. Heavy freezing spray warning through Friday night. Small craft advisory through Friday night. 11 p.m. Thursday, February 9th. Now laden with the 3,080 pounds of sardine bait and 7,060 pounds of squid bait for delivery to Trident on St. Paul Island, their transit time, straight to their port of call, was expected to be at least a day and a half. Their estimated time of arrival, or ETA, would be around Saturday the 11th or Sunday the 12th. After their dinner, the destination's 6 crew members prepped immediately to get underway. They'd depart Dutch Harbor by roughly 11:15 p.m., Thursday, February 9th. Update 3:44 a.m. Friday from the National Weather Service. Cape Sarachev to Nikolsky, Bering Side. Today, northeast wind 35 knots, seas 12 feet, freezing spray. Gale warning through tonight, heavy freezing spray tonight. Bering Sea offshore, east of longitude 171 west. Today, northeast wind 30 knots, seas 7 to 11 feet, heavy freezing spray. Heavy freezing spray warning through Saturday. The Pribilof Islands near shore waters. Today, northeast wind 30 knots, seas 9 feet, heavy freezing spray. Heavy freezing spray warning through Saturday. Small craft advisory through Saturday. In a satellite phone conversation with the Trident Seafoods fleet manager on St. Paul that took place early Friday afternoon during their transit, at about 1:30 p.m., from the Coast Guard, quote, "At approximately 1:30 p.m., the fleet manager at Trident Seafoods in St. Paul received a satellite phone call from the captain of the destination. The fleet manager explained that the captain informed him the destination was going to drop off 5 to 6 pallets of bait at the Trident facility in St. Paul for storage. The captain stated the destination was about 14 hours away from St. George Island and would be in St. Paul on either Saturday, February 11th or Sunday, February 12th. And the NTSB notes regarding this call, there was no mention of freezing spray or adverse weather conditions that would have delayed his expected time of arrival. Important to note, it wasn't as though other fishing crews completely avoided these conditions. For example, from the Coast Guard around this same time, quote, "The Aleutian Lady, a 154-foot house-forward crabbing vessel, was fishing for crab approximately 50 miles west of St. Paul Island. The Clipper Surprise, a 130-foot longliner vessel, was fishing approximately 10 to 15 miles southwest of St. George Island. The Polar Sea, a 105-foot house-forward crabbing vessel, was transiting towards St. Paul with no crab pots on board, approximately 20 miles north of St. George Island. The Bering Rose, a 125-foot trawler, was fishing approximately 10 miles north of St. George Island." End quote. The captain of these vessels state that they monitor freezing spray forecasts and take certain precautions to prevent ice accumulations. For instance, quote, "The captain of the Aleutian Lady stated he generally would reduce the number of pots loaded on deck prior to leaving port when the weather forecasts indicate heavy freezing spray. The captain of the Bering Rose stated, "Because it takes many hours for the crew to clear ice off the deck, it's best to slow down, go slower, or don't leave the dock." The captain of fishing vessel Silver Spray stated that, in his experience, he does not care to travel late in the evening because ice tends to build up more during the late evening hours than during the daylight hours. The captain of the Clipper Surprise stated, "During a nor'easter or steady northerly winds during the winter, vessels can run up into Zapadny Bay on the west side of St. George Island to anchor or jog around for protection and wait for the weather to clear." The captain of the Polar Sea stated that he always evaluates weather conditions, obtaining weather forecasts and reports numerous times a day from web pages and emails using the onboard computer. He also receives weather information by communicating with other vessels and from nearby processing facilities. On Friday, February 10, 2017, the captain of the Aleutian Lady stated his vessel experienced steady northeast winds of 35 knots, with temperatures dropping to the lower 20s. He directed his crew to stop fishing and break ice off the decks. Back aboard the Destination. At around 1:30 p.m. Friday that afternoon, the Destination appeared to change course slightly and slowed to about 2 or 3 knots. Investigators state this, quote, jog into the seas may have been required due to those significant winds out of the northeast, putting the vessel's bow directly into the wind and seas for a time as a storm survival tactic, like the Heave 2 Marine Electric performed in the stormy seas they encountered. I'll leave a link in description and pinned comment to our video on that vessel if you'd like to learn more later. But the Destination would get back on course and underway roughly 10 minutes later, averaging about 6.5 knots. Update 5:32 p.m. Friday evening from the National Weather Service. Cape Sarachev to Nikolsky, Bering side. Gale warning tonight. Tonight, northeast wind 35 knots, seas 14 feet, freezing spray. Bering Sea offshore east of longitude 171 west. Tonight, northeast wind 20 to 30 knots, seas 7 to 12 feet, heavy freezing spray. The Pribilof Islands near shore waters. Tonight, northeast wind 25 knots, gusts to 35 knots, seas 10 feet, heavy freezing spray. Heavy freezing spray warning through Saturday, small craft advisory through Saturday. And just a note, sunset would be around 5 p.m. in this area, according to the Coast Guard. Regarding that 1:30 p.m. jog into the seas earlier that day, from the Coast Guard, quote, the first occasion was on Friday the 10th from approximately 1:31 to 1:41 p.m., 10 minutes. The second jog occurred when the vessel reduced its speed from 6.5 knots down to 1.5 knots from approximately 10:10 through 10:50 p.m., or 40 minutes. According to both the U.S. Coast Guard and NTSB, the Destination's captain also had several conversations via satellite phone with the captain of the Aleutian Lady throughout Friday the 10th. Both fishing vessels were part of the same Alaska Fishers Co-op. The colleagues discussed their upcoming fishing game plan and how fishing was progressing in certain areas. They also lamented the need to bring so much extra bait out to Trident St. Paul, with the Aleutian Lady's captain stating, quote, none of us were really happy about the lack of bait or the fact that we had to bring out a lot of extra bait, because they were, at least we were told, there was not enough at the island. The fleet manager at Trident Seafood in St. Paul felt that Trident would run out before the fleet was done. I, like the captain of the Destination, brought out a lot of extra bait. They would also discuss their upcoming fishing quotas, the NTSB stating, quote, because the Destination's captain was apprehensive about delivering his quota by February 20 through 25th. They discussed having the Aleutian Lady harvest and deliver to St. Paul Island a larger share of the cooperative's North Crab quota than originally planned, and alternatively, the Destination catch more of the South quota. According to authorities, these calls with the Aleutian Lady's captain that evening would, quote, become the last known communication transmitted from the Destination. 3:53 a.m. Saturday morning, February 11th, from the National Weather Service. The Pribilof Islands near shore waters, small craft advisory today. Today, northeast wind 25 knots, seas 8 feet, freezing spray. From the U.S. Coast Guard. On Saturday, February 11th, 2017, at approximately 5 a.m., the Destination crossed the southwestern side of St. George Island. the vessel continued its course transiting between 1.5 to 3.5 nautical miles distance from the western coast, increasing its speed over ground from 7.8 to 9 knots. At approximately 5:55 a.m., the vessel crossed Dinoy Point, the northwestern tip of St. George Island. Illustrated in Figure 12 is the vessel's AIS track as it approached and passed St. George Island. Now, AIS, or Automatic Identification System, from the U.S. Coast Guard's Navigation Center, is a ship broadcast system that acts like a transponder, operating in the VHF maritime band, that is capable of handling well over 4,500 reports per minute and updates as often as every 2 seconds. Imagine a shipboard radar or an electronic chart display that includes a symbol for every significant ship within radio range, each with a velocity vector indicating speed and heading. Each ship's symbol can reflect the actual size of the ship, with position to GPS or differential GPS accuracy. By hovering over an AIS icon, you can learn the ship name, course, and speed, classification, call sign, registration number, MMSI, and other information. With this information, you can call any ship over VHF radio telephone by name, rather than by ship off my port bow, or some other imprecise means. Or you can dial it up directly using GMDSS equipment, where you can send to the ship or receive from it short safety-related email messages. According to the Coast Guard, the fishing vessel Clipper Surprise was the closest crew operating in the vicinity of the destination's transit on Saturday morning, February 11th. Quote, "The Clipper Surprise was fishing between 6 to 15 nautical miles west of St. George Island, taking advantage of the island's shelter to avoid ice buildup from the prevailing freezing spray, that wind and freezing spray being out of the northeast." Based on statements from recent former destination crew members from the NTSB, in their previous experience serving on board the destination, they stood a 1 or 2 hour wheelhouse watch alone when transiting at night, which involved keeping a lookout and monitoring radar, fathom meter, gauges, and autopilot. The watchstander was also tasked with monitoring live video of the engine room and making rounds through the engine room each hour to ensure that the level of water in the bilge was low, the fuel filter centrifuge was running, the fuel level in the day tank was adequate, and there was nothing out of the ordinary happening. Sometimes the round would include examining fish hold number 3 for water. Every 6 hours, at midnight, 6 a.m., 12 noon, and 6 p.m., the watch would also lubricate the shaft bearings. To help keep the watchstander awake, the vessel had a wheelhouse watch alarm located 10 feet from the helm chair. The alarm was set between 5 and 15 minutes. If it was not reset, an audible alert sounded. On February 11th at 5 a.m., the destination approached the southwestern side of St. George Island. The Coast Guard continues. The captain of the Clipper Surprise observed several vessels in Zapadny Bay hiding out from the weather closer to the shore. He observed the destination on AIS as it transited about a mile off the west coast of St. George Island. At 6:10 a.m., approximately 4.4 nautical miles northwest of Dinoy Point, the destination deviated from its course, turned to starboard, and reduced speed. Specifically, the vessel's heading turned to starboard from 330 degrees to 090 degrees. This resulted in a shift in its course over ground, or COG, from 340 degrees to 050 degrees, and its speed over ground, or SOG, from 7 knots to below 3 knots. At approximately 6:12 a.m., the vessel abruptly reduced speed from 1.5 knots to 0.9 knots. Although no vessels in the vicinity, nor the Coast Guard, received any sort of distress call via VHF or sat phone, at 6:15 a.m., the Coast Guard's District 17 Command Center suddenly received an EPIRB alert that turned out to be the fishing vessel destination. The pings from the destination's EPIRB, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, indicated a position roughly 2.7 nautical miles north of Dinoy Point, off St. George Island. Once the Coast Guard confirmed the EPIRB's registration, they'd attempt to call the vessel in distress and establish communications, getting no response. The District 17 Command Center then relayed this info to their search and rescue mission coordinator, who would immediately muster Coast Guard search and rescue units and make radio calls to nearby vessels looking for Samaritans willing to reach the incident area and provide aid as soon as possible. But it wouldn't be so cut and dried, as the conditions early in the AM were still rough, with ambient temperatures around 18 degrees Fahrenheit that morning, 37 degrees water temperature, light snow, cloudy skies, 9 miles of visibility, wind around 23 knots gusting to 34, and seas of about 13 feet. In fact, the first helo, an MH-60 Jayhawk Unit CG-6004, scrambled by the Coast Guard around 8:09 a.m., based out of Air Station Kodiak, experienced immediate ice accumulation around its engine inlets when taxiing to take off, forcing them to abort and return to the hangar for de-icing. The Coast Guard's HC-130, Unit CG-1714, also based out of Kodiak, was able to launch successfully at 7:45 a.m. and was en route toward the scene in the meantime. But the situation with the rescue helicopters was even more complex than that on this particular morning. That Kodiak-based Jayhawk wasn't the closest rescue helo to the potential rescue scene. Jayhawk Unit CG-6037, stationed at Forward Operating Base, or FOB, Cold Bay, was also activated, Cold Bay being 300 miles from the St. George Island area, while Air Station Kodiak is 600 miles away. And morning twilight, according to the NTSB, wouldn't be until around 9:15 a.m. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The Coast Guard describes search and rescue levels of readiness, including B-0 and B-2 status. B-0 means an aircraft will launch within 30 minutes of notification of distress, with an on-scene time within 90 minutes after launch. B-2 means an aircraft will launch within 2 hours of first notification of distress. B-2 readiness does not include a requirement for the aircraft to arrive on scene within a certain time frame. During search and rescue operations in the western Bering Sea region, the Coast Guard uses multiple aircraft, including one for cover and one for self-rescue. The cover aircraft, typically a C-130, provides communication support given the limited radio coverage in the Bering Sea. The self-rescue aircraft, usually a rotary wing or helicopter, launches so it is ready to respond if the first search and rescue helicopter goes down in the water. That Saturday, February 11, 2017, at Air Station Kodiak, an H-60 Jayhawk was in a B-0 status. The closer Cold Bay H-60 was in a B-2 status. And as the NTSB describes it, because of the open expanse of water, the helicopter from Cold Bay could not launch until the one from Kodiak appeared within 2 hours of its position, a safeguard for the crews in case one of the two aircrafts ditched into the near freezing waters. So with that delay of Kodiak's Jayhawk due to icing, the delay of the helicopter closest was compounded, and so on. Kodiak's Jayhawk Unit CG-6004 was able to get underway toward the scene again by 8:40 a.m. However, two quick-acting Good Samaritan vessels would be the first to actually arrive on scene. Fishing vessel Silver Spray would arrive by 9:30 a.m., and 20 minutes later would be joined by Bering Rose, seeing no trace of the destination other than a distinct oil sheen on the surface initially. By 10:13 a.m., according to the Coast Guard, C-130 Unit CG-1714 was on scene and, quote, commenced search patterns. The Coast Guard continues. At approximately 11:40 a.m., the Silver Spray located and recovered a life ring bearing the name Destination. By this point, the Silver Spray had also recovered a pair of loose buoys. Being fishers themselves, the Samaritan vessel's crew recognized these items immediately. The Cold Bay Jayhawk Unit CG-6037 arrived by roughly noon and commenced their search patterns as well. According to the NTSB, soon after that first Jayhawk arrived, they spotted the destination's EPIRB about a half-mile off St. George Island and, quote, directed the Silver Spray to the EPIRB's location, where the vessel's crew recovered it at 12:25 p.m. And I should point out, the destination's EPIRB, pictured here prior to the incident, was presumably just like so many others, encased inside the white-colored housing and mounted externally, in this instance, on the back of the vessel's house. EPIRBs and their casings are designed to deploy and activate automatically if submerged. And on screen is typically what the actual unit inside the housing looks like, a high-vis yellow beacon with a very distinctive shape. The recovered EPIRB was found tied by its own thin tether line to this large floating yellow line using electrical tape. The buoy setup recovered was also confirmed to have come from the destination, a loose pair that would normally be part of the equipment attached firmly by a thick rope line assigned to a crab pot. This was now approximately 6 hours after the EPIRB first started to ping, and still there was no sign of survivors or even a life raft. Life rafts and their pods also typically deploy automatically once submerged, and according to authorities, the destinations was indeed a life raft of that type. The pod visible in that same photo provided by authorities showing the EPIRB as well. And remember, the destination had received a safety exam just back in summer of 2016, which verified the presence of survival suits, life jackets, deployable life raft, EPIRB, and life rings. The distinct lack of emergency flotation equipment found on the surface, other than a single life ring, furthers the dread as to what the crew went through that fateful morning. Those on scene would continue their search into the evening and throughout the night. Sunday, February 12th, 2017. U.S. Coast Guard cutter Morgenthau, a 378-foot high-endurance Hamilton-class vessel, arrived by 10 a.m. the next day and assumed command of all search and rescue units. The cutter would also provide another helicopter, their onboard short-range search and rescue MH-65 Dolphin.
Hello, my name is Captain Ted St. Pierre. I'm the commanding officer of the Coast Guard cutter Morgenthau. Morgenthau is currently just south of St. George's Island, acting as the on-sea coordinator for a search party involving Coast Guard helicopters, airplanes, and Good Samaritan vessels. On Saturday morning, while moored in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, we were alerted of the activation of an EPIRB belonging to a fishing vessel. I immediately initiated a crew recall in order to get underway and make best speed to the fishing vessel's last known position. As one of the Coast Guard's largest vessels, we also maintain an embarked helicopter that we were able to deploy early Sunday morning to begin the search ahead of our arrival to the area. So far, debris from the vessel, including tarps and a life ring, have been found, and we continue to search for the 6 people who are on board the vessel at the time of distress. We also greatly appreciate the efforts of the fishing vessel Silver Spray and the fishing vessel Bering Rose for their assistance in the search. The crew of the Coast Guard cutter Morgenthau has a great deal of respect for the men and women who fish the treacherous waters of the Bering Sea, and we wish them all well.
Based on the local water and weather conditions from the U.S. Coast Guard watchstanders used the probability of survival decision aid to calculate best-case survival times. Functional time was 8.06 hours, and predicted cold survival time was 10.65 hours, assuming crew members were wearing a clothing ensemble of shirt, sweater, and survival suit. In addition to the Silver Spray and Bering Rose, eventually in total, the NTSB states, the Coast Guard's assets included 2 HC-130 Hercules airplanes, 2 MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters, 1 MH-65 Dolphin helicopter, and the Coast Guard cutter Morgenthau. The Coast Guard continues. During search and rescue operations, the Coast Guard conducted 21 total search sorties, consisting of 69.71 hours, 5,731 square nautical miles of ocean, and 5,887 nautical track miles searched. And from the NTSB, after spending more than 3 days searching those 5,731 square miles, the Coast Guard suspended search efforts for the 6 mariners on Tuesday, February 14th at 5 p.m. due to the diminished chance of crew member survival. The decision was based primarily on the time that had elapsed, which exceeded that survival time of 10.65 hours predicted for crew members wearing a survival suit. On Tuesday evening, February 14th, roughly 80 hours after the EPIRB began to ping, the destination and all 6 crew members were ultimately presumed lost. This incident was absolutely devastating for the Alaska fishing community. The destination was well known, well established, and had a decades-long positive reputation in local waters. Recent crews were known for being knowledgeable mariners and for being rugged, reliable, tight-knit, close friends who knew their vessel well. The destination was initially determined to have gone down in approximately 250 feet of water, 7 nautical miles off St. George. The Coast Guard, quote, was the lead federal agency for initial evidence collection activities and led all efforts to recover additional evidence at the casualty site. The NTSB participated in all hearing sessions. The Marine Board and NTSB shared all evidence and factual material gathered throughout the course of their investigations. However, the Marine Board and NTSB worked separately during the analysis phase in order to prepare independent conclusions and recommendations. Initial information gathering would include activities like compiling the testimony of recent former crewmates, acquiring those vessel maintenance, conversion, stability, purchase, and inspection records, gathering that CCTV footage, those last known photos of the destination, testimony and records from those fellow fishing boat captains, and during that same weather, in the same general area that night. The list goes on. Despite all this, after months of investigation, the vessel's exact location and orientation on the seafloor still hadn't been confirmed, which we will cover shortly. But amongst the standout findings, like a full load of crab pods and confirmed heavy freezing spray that had already tipped investigators off, in both agencies' reports, and the Coast Guard especially, they also take issue with their findings of quite pronounced, ongoing crew fatigue and downright exhaustion aboard the destination. For example, the U.S. Coast Guard provides a couple instances of communications directly from crew members to family regarding fatigue, a grueling cod fishing season, and an expected, even more demanding, upcoming crab season. The first exchange was via text messages that January, just a few weeks prior to the sinking, between a crew member and his significant other. Tuesday, January 3rd, quote, "Oh my God, so no sleep for the month of January, for us, 19 on, 5 off. We do a 4-man deck instead of 5, and the boat works around the clock. But every 4th hour, you man the deck, and I have to cook during all this, so I probably won't get any sleep. F my life, all for 30 cents a pound," referring to the price per pound of their catch. Sunday, January 22nd. Blowing 70, gusting 100 in False Pass, trying to offload to tender, rolling on 30 hours and only 2.5 hours of sleep. Monday, January 23rd. F, this sucks. Fish got stuck in suction pump of tank, tearing apart all the pipes in engine room. Not even Opies yet, meaning they hadn't moved on to Opelio crab fishing yet. We're gonna be so burnt out, and now we have to put on all the gear and do cod on the south side. Wednesday, January 25th. Derek's hip is killing him. He hasn't told the captain yet, but he'll see how he feels after cod. Saturday, January 28th. Back's killing me now. F, I'm done. Yeah, my body is done. Wednesday, February 8th. Oh my God, I can't even put up enough energy to crawl in my top bunk. I just keeled over at the galley table. Can't even make a fist with my hand, it hurts so bad. Probably gonna pull an all-nighter just to get out of here. I'm tired, and I'm the only one waking up, supposed to start back up at 6. We need coffee. Another crew member would text with his father that January as well. Monday, January 23rd, quote, "Oh my God, I haven't slept in days. We fished right outside of False Pass, blowing 100 when we were offloading, and busted a circ pipe in the suction screen. Engineer pumped down and sucked cod all the way up to the pump after doing the tank. I slept for 4 hours last night after my anchor watch, and 2 hours before in the last 40. Cod closes on Wednesday at noon. Have to make the tide tonight at 2 a.m., 4 to 5 hours to the gear. I'll sleep then, but probably fish straight through from 6 to 7 a.m. on Tuesday till the gear is on the boat Wednesday at noon because we're a day behind." Saturday, January 28th. Back is shot right now though. Can't feel my hands for about an hour whenever I wake up. Pulled a side muscle on my ribs a week ago. Derek's hip is about to blow out. Guys are beat up for 30 cents a pound. I'm just scared we're going to get out there and the Opelio crabs are going to disappear and we're going to be stuck there grinding when this should have been a quick season. July 2017, 6 months after the incident. It would take roughly 6 months before the resources were allocated to begin locating and investigating the actual wreck site, where the destination lay roughly 250 feet deep off St. George Island. On July 8, 2017, NOAA research vessel Fairweather, quote, used side-scan sonar and located the destination in 78 meters, or 256 feet of water, approximately 7 nautical miles north of Dinoy Point, St. George Island. Aside from AIS tracking, this sonar image of the destination would be the first potential sighting of any kind ever since the fishing vessel left Dutch Harbor 6 months prior, on that fateful Thursday evening back in February. Later in July, U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy, an extremely capable medium icebreaker or polar-class vessel, arrived to begin ROV operations and potentially perform more evidence gathering if possible. From the U.S. Coast Guard. On July 25, 2017, the Coast Guard's Regional Dive Locker West, working on the Coast Guard cutter Healy, deployed a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, over the site to collect imagery of the wreck. Due to strong subsurface currents, the ROV was unable to collect substantial imagery or locate the life raft, but was able to confirm the vessel's distinct colors, waterline, draft marks, and name. Presumably, this meant they also could not confirm the status of the life raft pod, did not end up seeing inside the vessel, nor could they confirm the presence of survival suits, victims, or anything else in the vessel's interior. After confirming the sonar sighting, the destination's potential orientation on the seafloor, and precise location, the Healy's crew would also locate and retrieve one of the crab pots from the wreckage. This individual crab pot, while damaged, was still intact to the point where it contained all of its gear, like lines and buoys, the stowed configuration it would have presumably been in during the vessel's final voyage. However, this crab pot told its own story of even more potential ongoing stability questions that investigators took issue with. 700 pounds on paper. From the U.S. Coast Guard. When developing the destination stability instructions in '93, the qualified individual used 700 pounds as the weight of each crab pot, including gear, within his calculations. The captain of the vessel at the time informed him of the crab pot's weight. The qualified individual did not verify the actual weight of each pot through direct observation. Further, the qualified individual did not specifically indicate the weight of each crab pot within the stability instructions. The destination's owner had purchased new pots since the '93 stability instructions. The owner purchased pots measuring 7 by 7 foot by 34 inches to replace the 6.5 by 6.5 foot by 34 inch pots. The Coast Guard describes records of the owner purchasing 25 pots in May of 2000 at 7 by 7 feet. Only this time, they showed a calculated weight of 721 pounds, not including gear. The Coast Guard continues. Dorian Metal Fab and Eclipse Gear Supply, the companies that supplied the replacement pots to the owner before 2016, have since gone out of business. Dungeness Gear Works, the company that last supplied refurbished pots to the destination, provided limited records regarding pot sales to the vessel. The owner of Dungeness Gear Works confirmed selling those 25 pots in May of 2000, and that they were 7 by 7 foot by 34 inches. However, quote, he calculated the weight of the materials supplied on the cut sheet, which showed each pot weighed 721 pounds. Lines and buoys weighed 149 pounds, for a total of 870 pounds. In June of 2016, the owner of the destination purchased 101 reconditioned pots from Dungeness Gear Works. The owner of Dungeness Gear Works stated, they do not weigh the pots prior to delivering them to a customer. Rather, they calculate the weight of the pots based on the cut length of the steel used during reconditioning, and determine the total weight of those 101 pots, each to be 719 pounds. The owner of the destination did not keep records of the crab pots indicating its specifications or when purchased. He stated that he knew the crab pots were each 7 by 7 feet by 34 inches, but did not know the number or weights of those pots on board the vessel. When asked to provide the weight of the crab pots, he stated, I don't know. You guys probably know more than I do if you've retrieved a pot. I don't know the weight of it now. If we use an easy number to compare these individual weights when stacked on deck, like 200 units total, at 700 pounds each, the total would be 140,000 pounds or 70 US tons, with 101 of those at 719 pounds each, as just one example, described from those purchased in 2016. You'd go from 140 to to about 142,000 pounds, adding nearly a full ton. Not to mention those 25 purchased back in 2000 at a weight of 870 pounds total per unit, if they were still in use. But that crab pot recovered by the Healy, quote, using the cutter's crane and calibrated scale, weighed 880 pounds, including the gear stored inside. This was initially only an estimate based on the cutter's crane scale, so quote, on August 24, 2017, while the Healy was back in Dutch Harbor, CFVEs, or Commercial Fishing Vessel Examiners, from Marine Safety Detachment Dutch Harbor, examined the recovered pot and collected additional information. The crab pot was damaged, but measurements taken indicate a top bar length of 7 by 7 feet and a depth overall of 32 inches. The pot contained 2 buoys, each stenciled with a number. The larger yellow buoy had 42234, and the smaller red buoy had 50. The 42234 matches the destination's ADF&G, or Alaska Department of Fish and Game, shellfish vessel registration number. There were 3 34-inch lines in the pot, 2 red lines and 1 light blue. When taken out on deck, the red lines measured at 177 and 197 feet, and the blue line measured at 189 feet. The combined weight of the gear, buoys and lines, was 140 pounds, and the pot itself weighed 700 pounds, for a total combined weight of 840 pounds. The Coast Guard also states, quote, multiple former crew members stated the captain consistently carried 200 crab pots. The captain was comfortable carrying 200 pots as it was a manageable number for maximum efficiency. The size of pots fit the boat well and allowed the crew to move the pots in a timely manner. One former crew member referred to the captain's preferred 200 pot load as a haystack, a big stack. Ice accumulation. Investigators didn't base their findings of heavy freezing spray as potential cause on forecasts and weather records alone. The ice accumulation, also known as accretion, experienced by those other crews in the area that night was significant and troublesome for them as well, based on thorough testimony and photographic evidence. This graphic, created by the Marine Board, shows the approximate location of each vessel around the time the destination was presumed to have gone under. The fishing vessel Polar Sea, roughly 20 nautical miles northwest of St. George, the Bering Rose, 8 to 10 nautical miles north of the island, and the Clipper Surprise, 20 nautical miles to the southwest. This photo, taken by a crew member aboard the Bering Rose early that morning, shows ice accumulation on deck aft of their wheelhouse, with that captain stating, quote, they experienced weather out of the northeast, 35-40 heavy freezing spray and 15-foot seas. The vessel had ice accumulations of over a quarter of an inch per hour. The captain of the Bering Rose stated the waters around St. George Island, especially the northwestern side, Dinoy Point, are notorious for its nasty sea state and winds. Conditions are worse when the winds are from the northeast, and especially when the winds are going in the opposite direction or against the tide. The vessel Polar Sea was perhaps the most telling, with photos taken by the captain showing an overwhelming amount of ice accumulation. And, even more shocking, was that these photos potentially don't show the total ice that could have been accumulated, as the Polar Sea completely stopped and was diligent about breaking ice off in 4 separate sessions, each a grueling 5 hours long. Quote, the captain of the Polar Sea stated, during the transit towards St. Paul Island on Friday, February 10th, his vessel experienced wind at about 35 to 40, and I would say about a 15-foot sea. The vessel accumulated ice from freezing spray, requiring his crew to break ice off the decks. The captain stated that he stopped transiting 4 times on Friday, so his crew could work, breaking off the ice, with each evolution lasting about 5 hours each. The captain of the Polar Sea stated that on the morning of Saturday, February 11th, he could not assist with the search for the destination because of safety reasons. He had to take into account the heavy ice that accumulated on board his vessel and the prevailing freezing spray conditions. And keep in mind, the Polar Sea was transiting nearly the same waters at roughly the same time as the destination. The destination's only deviations from their primary course, according to authorities, were those 2 brief jogs, slowing and pointing into the prevailing seas and weather, but getting back on course in roughly an hour or less each time. And the NTSB also points out fishing vessel Sandra 5. The Sandra 5, a 113-foot house-aft crab fishing vessel, departed St. Paul Island on February 10th and arrived in King Cove 2 days later. Upon its arrival, the vessel had accumulated over 6 inches of ice while traveling at speeds above 6 knots from the time it departed St. George Island. Sailing in opposite directions, the Sandra 5 and the destination were about 37 miles apart at 1:55 a.m. on the morning of February 11th, approximately 4 hours before the incident. And the Sandra 5, arriving in King Cove on Sunday, February 12, 2017, is where this now iconic photo comes from, showing the extreme ice accumulation that can penetrate into and completely surround stacks of crab pots. These photos all stark reminders of just how deadly this phenomenon can be. And just to note, from the U.S. Coast Guard, the Silver Spray, that Samaritan vessel who aided in the search for destination, a 116-foot house-forward crabbing vessel, was anchored overnight in St. Paul and was in the process of departing, which would explain how they were able to leave out and be on scene so quickly that fateful Saturday morning. An open hatch routine. From the U.S. Coast Guard. While in transit with pots on deck, the captain consistently directed the crew to keep access covers to number 1 and 2 holds closed and number 3 off. This image shows the access hatch cover to number 3 hold located on deck, aft of the open number 2 hold hatch. The cover was typically stored on deck in close proximity to the number 3 hold. One former crew member stated, "When I was on the boat, I had a hatch cover open on the aft tank. The engineer said, the captain wants it that way, and that was the way it was." Another former crew member stated, "Tank 3, we usually left the hatch off. Actually, we always left the hatch off." A closer look at these photos shows the access portion of the main hatch being this separate round cover within each, presumably 36 inches in width or less, because otherwise, the tunnel created by the first layer of crab pots would block the ability to even replace the hatch in an emergency. The Coast Guard continues. Former crew members stated the crew needed to access the steering room or lazarette to access steering lines and pumps and to check or address flooding and access number 3 hold in order to reach the opening to the stern tube and stuffing box. The captain of the destination consistently directed the crew to keep the number 3 hold access hatch open, even in transit. The Marine Board does not have direct evidence to confirm the status of this hatch during the vessel's transit from Dutch Harbor. However, working on the premise that the access hatch was always open, it would have significantly reduced the vessel's overall buoyancy due to uncontrolled downflooding of the number 3 hold. Probable cause. From the NTSB. A varied amount of other evidence suggests that the vessel capsized. The forecast from the National Weather Service predicted heavy freezing spray at the time of the sinking, which other vessels in the vicinity of the destination experienced. However, automatic identification system data did not show a significant course change or reduction in speed after 10:50 p.m. on the night before the incident, indicating that the destination crew did not take measures to mitigate the ice accumulation during the last 7 hours of the transit. The rough sea and strong wind conditions at the time of the sinking would have caused the vessel to heel. As AIS data shows, for the last few minutes before the sinking, the vessel experienced a rapid heading change and speed reduction. In addition, no one escaped from the vessel or made a mayday call, indicating that the capsizing occurred quickly and without warning. The investigation considered steering gear failure as a cause of the capsize, but there is no indication that the recently overhauled steering system contributed to the cause of the incident. AIS data shows 2 significant heading changes from the original course to St. Paul Island during the last 17 hours of the voyage. The first one was 10 minutes, and the second was a 60-minute slowdown from 9:50 to 10:50 p.m., about 8 hours before the sinking. Investigators do not know why the vessel slowed for this hour. The slowdown could have been indicative of a mechanical problem, the crew securing pots, or perhaps the vessel turning into the wind to allow the crew to mechanically break ice. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of the capsizing and sinking of the fishing vessel Destination was the captain's decision to proceed during heavy freezing spray conditions without ensuring the vessel had a margin of stability to withstand an accumulation of ice, or without taking sufficient mitigating action to avoid or limit the effects of icing. Now, the NTSB's report was published in June of 2018, roughly a year and a half after the incident. However, from what I gather, those in the know were expecting the Coast Guard's report to be more thorough and provide more context. From an Anchorage Daily News article dated February 10th of 2019, for example, quote, "The NTSB concluded that freezing spray coated the destination, making it disastrously top-heavy. The agency blamed the captain for venturing out in hazardous conditions without taking proper precautions, and then, once at sea, failing to have the crew combat the ice buildup. Yet a Coast Guard analysis, using computer modeling, shows that long before the winter storm, the destination's margin of safety had been eroded by changes to the vessel and gear. By the time the crew set out on its final voyage, according to the analysis, the heavily loaded boat failed to meet minimum stability standards called for by a 1988 Act of Congress. This assessment is part of a broader Coast Guard report expected to be made public this year, a document eagerly awaited by families struggling to understand what could have gone wrong for such an experienced crew." The Coast Guard's Marine Board report would actually be published just a couple weeks after that ADN article, on February 27th, 2019, a full 2 years after the sinking. Indeed, the Coast Guard was much more critical of the interaction of several factors that they feel led to this tragedy. I was going to read from the Marine Board of Investigation's primary cause, but I'd like to take it a step further. Typically with these more modern reports, an action by the commandant write-up becomes the opening statements for each Marine Board report, although in typical Coast Guard fashion, this part was quite verbose as well. But to simplify, the Commandant attempts to make clear their comments, summaries, takeaways, and agreements, with conclusions and recommendations, adding their response in slightly more concise language, still wordy nonetheless. In this case, we'll read from the, at the time, Rear Admiral and Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy, J.P. Nadeau's summary of primary cause. Quote, "While many factors contributed to this marine casualty, the most significant were the vessel's unsafe stability condition due to the combined detrimental effects of carrying heavier crab pots than stability instructions anticipated, carrying additional bait high atop these crab pots, ice accumulation from freezing spray, and downflooding from the open number 3 cargo hatch. Critical to the stability of uninspected fishing vessels is the owner's use of a qualified individual to perform tests or calculations necessary to evaluate the vessel's stability and update onboard stability instructions. This was not done despite several changes made to destination's characteristics after stability instructions were issued in '93. In addition, the master did not follow the vessel's stability instructions when he allowed number 3 deck hatch to be open and loaded bait high atop the crab pots. The master also sailed from Dutch Harbor under heavy freezing spray warnings, with a fatigued crew unfit to properly remove ice accumulations and perform other emergency actions. This combination of actions and events placed destination in a very vulnerable condition and compromised the vessel and crew's ability to survive when exposed to wind and waves beyond the lee of St. George Island in the early morning hours of February 11th, 2017. And we'll also read the Coast Guard's summary as to the most likely scenario during the incident voyage leading to the sudden loss of buoyancy and what little stability the vessel had left. But keep in mind, their actual conclusions section, though, is a full 2-page long item-by-item scathing review of the captain and owner's actions. Quote, "After passing Dinoy Point, the destination's transit was no longer in the protection of the leeward side of St. George Island. Exposed to building seas and hazardous currents, the vessel turned into the seas. After making the turn, the vessel suddenly lost speed and became exposed to boarding seas that resulted in swamping and downflooding of the vessel. The vessel's loading condition far exceeded stability criteria anticipated or evaluated within the stability instructions and was significantly below the required standards, with narrow room for absorbing additional stability risk from the cumulative effects of heavier pots, ice load, and downflooding. It was doubtful the vessel could maintain buoyancy and survive hazardous conditions. In addition, the Coast Guard also points out, crew members left the bridge unattended every hour with the autopilot on to visually inspect the engine room. During these rounds, they would grease the cutlass bearings on the shaft every 6 hours at midnight, 6 a.m., 12 noon, and 6 p.m. Unquote. The EPIRB began to ping at 6:14 a.m. that morning, and 6 a.m. is one of those times noted by the Coast Guard where the watchstander's rounds are more thorough than the normal on-the-hour routine, including greasing bearings on the prop shaft. Along with those other hourly duties, their wheel watch duty sheet instructed. Their AIS track line also shows no stoppages long enough to heave to and break ice, an hours-long process once stopped, suggesting they may have been pushing straight through in an attempt to make best speed to their next port of call at St. Paul Island. The Coast Guard continues, chipping and removing ice off a vessel is strenuous work, taking a vessel's crew many hours to complete. Given the crew was fatigued from its recent cod fishing season, they most likely didn't have the stamina to dedicate the required amount of energy and effort needed to clear the vessel of ice accumulations while underway. Working less than 1 hour does not appear long enough to manage the ice accumulation and improve the vessel's stability condition. The exact area in which the destination was lost has been well known for creating deadly sea states given the appropriate conditions. From the Anchorage Daily News, quote, "At 5:55 a.m., the destination cleared Dinoy Point on the edge of St. George Island. The wind was blowing from the northeast as the boat entered a notorious stretch of water, roiled not only by the wind, but by strong currents intensified by the island landmass. That can be a real hellhole," said the captain of the Aleutian Mariner crab boat, who traversed that area numerous times during more than 30 years. "When you come around the corner, the current can stand the seas straight up. They get real sharp and they break." The NTSB also points out, if the captain was not awake at night, the lone watchstander would have to judge the danger of icing and alert the captain. If the captain was alerted of the icing before leaving the lee of St. George Island, he could have used the protection of the lee to mitigate the icing. Yet, AIS data shows that the vessel kept a steady course after 10:50 p.m., and its speed increased to 9 knots while in the lee. The data did not reveal the vessel slowing down, during which time the crew could have broken ice or heaved to behind the island. There is the possibility, as the Anchorage Daily News also points out, given everything discovered by investigators, that the destination's off-duty crew were asleep in their bunks, getting some long-awaited rest. And sailing into those treacherous waters off Dinoy Point could have destabilized the vessel so suddenly, right around that 6 a.m. mark, that the watchstander may have also been below, caught off guard in the engine room, making his rounds with no time to react accordingly at the vessel's controls. Recommendations. As for the recommendations, we're going to try more of a summary this time as they're extremely lengthy and repetitive, even more so than usual. Summarizing the U.S. Coast Guard safety recommendations. Recommend District 13 and 17 conduct education and outreach to promote awareness, compliance, and training opportunities with commercial fishing vessel or CFV stability instruction requirements of the appropriate current CFRs. Conduct a targeted oversight audit on all Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, or BSAI, crabbing vessels operating or home ported in their respective area of responsibility. Develop policy regarding stability and safety compliance checks, or SSCs, in Alaska Department of Fish and Game, or ADF&G, 24-hour notice regulations. Recommend that District 13 and 17 commercial fishing vessel examiners use direct verification to weigh the vessel's crab pots during dockside safety examinations and SSCs. Recommend the Commandant conduct a targeted oversight audit on all commercial fishing vessels subject to the stability requirements of the appropriate CFRs. Require owners to ensure the qualified individual includes within the stability instructions the assumed weight of crab pots used within the stability calculations. Amend 46 CFR 28.550 icing to reflect the intent of the icing regulations as indicated in the preamble to the final rule. Amend 46 CFR Part 28 Subpart E stability to require CFV owners and captains to present evidence of course completion after attending Coast Guard approved stability training, and requires CFV owners to notify the Coast Guard when the vessel undergoes modifications, conversions, or substantial alterations, and if the owner selected a qualified individual to conduct a stability assessment. Requires CFV owners to maintain an on-board and shoreside record of all incremental weight changes to the vessel's lightship condition and fishing/cargo gear. Requires CFV owners and captains implement shipboard policies to address crew rest, work hours, and fatigue. Administrative recommendations included recommend sector Puget Sound rescind acceptance of the NAVTEC/USSA third-party surveyor who conducted the last dockside safety examination on the destination in June 2016. Recommend District 17 conduct a search and rescue case study regarding search and rescue operations for the destination. As for the NTSB, since this was a marine accident brief from the safety board though, their usual recommendations weren't present in their initial report, like they'd normally be in their MARs or marine accident reports. Their recommendations were limited to an ice accumulation safety alert, a PDF handout they created separately in June of 2018. From the NTSB's safety alert, ice accumulation, the solution, what mariners can do. During winter months, consult the National Weather Service's freezing spray forecasts and plan transits and fishing operations accordingly to decrease the risks of hazardous conditions. Should your vessel be exposed to freezing spray conditions, consider the following precautions. Decrease the number of pots on board or other gear above the main deck to reduce the available surface area for accumulating ice. These measures also serve to lower the vessel's center of gravity, thereby increasing its stability margin prior to encountering icing conditions. Cover deck loads/pots with tarps to shed water. Lessen exposure to high seas and winds by reducing speed, changing heading, seeking shelter, such as a lee behind a landmass, removing ice manually, breaking ice. Develop procedures and schedules for crew members to break ice and navigate during freezing spray conditions. Ensure that your vessel is fitted with proper equipment to break accumulated ice. Ensure the crews are rested and prepared to operate in freezing spray conditions. Understand your vessel's stability information. Ensure that the vessel is operating below the limits set in the stability information, and that the vessel's arrangement, equipment, and operation closely match the conditions listed in the stability information.
In addition to making sure that each boat has the required survival gear on board, we review the vessel's loaded condition with the master to ensure compliance with the vessel's stability instructions. Stability checks are absolutely critical every year because the gear on the crab boat is constantly changing. Captains and crew learn about the maximum allowable load for their boats, as well as precisely how they need to be loaded. Recent tragedies in these fisheries have shed light on just how important our stability checks are for the fishing fleet. Fishing vessels Destination and Scandies Rose sank in February 2017 and New Year's Eve 2019, respectively, claiming the lives of 11 fishermen.
Did you test the hyperbole all over?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Fishermen are reminded of their requirement to call the Coast Guard each time they prepare to depart port loaded with the pot gear. As the winter season approaches, vessel stability becomes even more crucial.
The final recommendation from the Marine Board's report. Recommend District 17 recognize the captain and crew of the Bering Rose and Silver Spray for their actions and efforts to deviate course, proceed to the destination's last known position, and participate as Good Samaritans, assisting in search and rescue operations for the destination's crew. Their names memorialized, the destination's crew joins those honored at the Fisherman's Memorial in Seattle, Washington. This content just wouldn't be possible without you, the viewers, supporters, subscribers, and especially those who watch all the way to the end. Thank you. And a special thanks goes out to those top-tier supporters on Patreon. Wyatt C., Woods Wolf, Vlad B., Tristan B., The Handkerchief, Storm S., Space Cadet and Operative Gamma, Someone on Earth 598, Sawyer A., Robert G., Rats and Lab Coats, Philip A. L., Peyton, Paul Z., P. Rush, Paul Rohrbaugh, Paris Antisis, Owen W., Neil Cunningham, Michael Moat, Michael, Megan M., Meg T., Maximum Hats, Maxim K., Matt W., Mark W., Manuel M., Lisa J., Library of Scars, Leighton, Kyle W., Justin S., Joshua S., Jenica S., James L., James D., Hunter B., Hazmat Unit, Hayden Taylor, Hank H., Grumman Cat, Elijah C., Dylan B., Drew That 180 R, David M., Dagger F., Colin D., Christian T., Chaz B., Cadillac, Caroline, Calliope Cleopatra, Broken Spectrum, Brendan C., Bonesaw 7590, Anthony, Anna B., Andrew M., Andrew F., Alex S., and Aaron M. And don't forget, your safety matters.